Well, good evening, everybody. It's snowy. We got sick folks. We got traveling folks. But we're here. So glad to see everyone tonight. So we're talking about Abram tonight, or how we usually call him Abraham, but I'm putting Abram up here because in Genesis 12, that's his name. He doesn't become Abraham until later on in the story. But that's our lesson for this evening, is Genesis chapter 12. Last week we talked about Job, and just kind of go back and remind ourselves of what happened to Job. The story of Job begins with God allowing Satan to test Job, and what that teaches us is that God does allow Satan to test his people. And the story of Job also reminds us that bad things do happen to good people. And that's something that Job's friends tried to convince him was not the case. They tried to convince him that he had done something wrong, and that's what had caused all of this calamity in his life. But really what the book is about is how a good man goes through a lot of terrible things, and he searches for an answer to that very basic question, why? Why did this happen to me? And his friends have all kinds of reasons. Job thinks he understands why, but at the end of the day, no one really has a good grasp on why these things happen. And so God comes in at the end basically to teach Job, hey, times like this, just trust me, because if you remain faithful in the face of adversity, there is great reward that lies at the end. How does the story of Job end? Well, it ends with all of his wealth being restored, he has children again, and as the old saying goes, he lived happily ever after, right? And of course, we can't expect that necessarily in this life. When bad things happen to us in this life, it doesn't mean that all things will turn out well in this life. But what we have the hope of is that at the end, when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, we're going to hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the kingdom of your Lord. That's the reward we're looking for, and that's the reward that God promises us. So the story of Job shows us how to persevere through trials. Job gives us a good example of why these things happen and how to deal with these things when they do happen. Are there any other questions about Job? Anything lingering out there? Loose ends to tie up? Does that pretty well sum up the 45 minutes we spent on Job last week? All right. Well, let's talk about Abram in Genesis chapter 12. And I want to do just a little bit of a backup here and go back into chapter 11, verses 27 through 32, because here we're introduced to the family of Abram. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begat Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, and she had no child. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Aren't you glad you didn't have to pronounce all those names? It's a lot of those difficult names. All right, so basically what we're introduced to the family of Abram, and his father is a man by the name of Terah. And I want you to keep that in mind, because we're going to talk here in a few minutes about some of the reasons why Abram was told by God to leave his family behind. But let's just do a little bit of a geography study real quick. So this is a map of part of the Fertile Crescent. We looked at a map kind of like this a couple of weeks ago. So you might remember we looked at a ziggurat from this area called Ur of the Chaldeans, and that's where this story begins, right? This is the origins of Abram's family. They live down here in the south. And you've got the Tigris and Euphrates rivers running like this, right? That creates the Fertile Crescent, which kind of goes up like that and off the screen there. Anyways, all right. So that's the area of the world we're talking about. Let me pull this up one more time. I want to get rid of all that stuff. Can I do that? I'll figure it out later. Anyways, you all get the idea. The other last thing I wanted to point out was where Haran is. So Haran's up here, and you can see here on the map, although I've covered it up with a lot of red drawings now, there's a couple of possible routes that Abram could have taken and his family could have taken from Ur the Chaldeans, which is down here in the south, up to Haran. And we're not told why they went up there, but it does seem like that maybe the family had gone through a time of tragedy. What had happened in Abram's family? Well, his youngest brother had died, and his youngest brother had died before his father had died. And, you know, the loss of a child can be it's always a traumatic event for parents, right? In fact, I've heard it described that there's nothing worse for a parent than losing a child. And it doesn't matter how old they are. That's something that affects them no matter their age. And, you know, I know people who have buried multiple children, and it's just really something to see those people hold it together. I don't know how they do that. Anyways, I wonder if perhaps they left Ur the Chaldeans because family tragedy had struck. But they come up to this place called Haran, and that's where God speaks to Abram in Genesis chapter 12. The other thing I wanted to notice in that little introduction there was Abram married Sarai. Her name is later changed to Sarah, right? And we're told that she was barren. So that's an important little detail to bear in mind because of what we're about to read in chapter number 12. Here we have two older people, one of which has never been able to conceive a child. And yet in chapter number 12, God is going to make a promise that implies that Abraham is going to have descendants. As he goes on to say in chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now remember, Lot is Abram's nephew, but he's the son of Haran, Abram's youngest brother who died prematurely, died at a young age, or a younger age. Guess we don't really know how old he was when he passed away, but I think that's an important little detail. It's almost like, you know, Abram's maybe playing a father figure to Lot because Lot had lost his father at a younger age. Anyways, that's just a little bit of reading between the lines. But there's several things in this promise that are important for us to understand. And these are the beginnings of the covenant that God is going to form with the descendants of Abram. Okay, I call him Abraham here because I'm just being inconsistent. So don't let that throw you off too much. But Chad might point that out to me, so I thought I'd just get ahead of it there. Because I'm going to call him Abram in this first bullet point, right? So the first blessing God says is he would be blessed, or he would not be blessed until he left his father's home. That's the contingent, the contingency that Abraham has to meet in order for all of this to come to fruition. He has to leave his father's home behind. Now, he didn't leave all of his family behind, which is what God told him to do. That's going to happen naturally in a couple of chapters. Abram and Lot are going to need to part ways. Actually, I think it happens in chapter 13. They have to part ways because they've become so big that they're becoming a nuisance to their neighbors. So that eventually does happen, but it is worth pointing out that Abram keeps the command, but maybe not as fully as he could have. That breaking away from his family was a difficult thing to do. And I think we all could relate. if you've been living around your family for 75 years, there's a lot of connection and ties that are very deeply held together. Some of you have lived near your parents for that long, so you know what I'm talking about. I'll never experience that. My mom passed away many years ago now, and my dad lives down in Oklahoma, so we're just not around each other a whole lot. So I don't have that kind of tie like Abram does. I imagine this was a very difficult thing to do, something that some of you might be able to relate to better than I can. But God wanted to make Abram into a great nation, that in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. He's a little bit more explicit about this later on in chapter number 15. He tells Abram to go out and look up at the heavens and to see all the stars in the sky, and he says, so shall your descendants be. And of course, he's saying this to a man who's 75 years old, and his wife is barren. So what God is promising to do is something that sort of defies man's ability to accomplish. And that's going to become one of the themes we see come back over and over in the story of Abram. Abram and Sarah try to create an heir for themselves, right, through her concubine Hagar. And they have this child Ishmael. And Abram even says at one point, why can't you just accept Ishmael? He's my heir. He came from my body. Under the customs of the time, Ishmael was a perfectly acceptable heir for whatever inheritance God had in mind for Abram. And yet, God intended to accomplish the impossible by, I think, miraculously enabling Abraham and Sarah to have a child in their advanced years. The other thing I want to notice about this passage here is God says to Abram that he would bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. And that's the foundation for some of the promises God makes to the children of Israel later on, that he will be their defender against their enemies, and he will also bless them if they remain faithful to him. All right, so these are the beginnings of the covenant that God forms, not just with Abram, but also with his descendants. Now, it's worth thinking about for a moment, why did Abram have to leave behind his family? Why leave his family behind? Well, Joshua tells us why at the end of the book of Joshua. This is in Joshua chapter 24, verses 2 and 3. Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants, and gave him Isaac. Now, the river that Joshua was talking about is the Jordan River, right? They're west of that. They're in the Canaan land, although there was an allotment given to Manasseh and a couple of other tribes on the east side of the Jordan. But when he says on the other side of the river, he's talking about, over to the east. Over there is where Terah came from. And Terah was an idolater. He worshipped false gods. And this does seem to be the reason why God called Abram to leave his family behind. God wanted to become Abram's God. And he couldn't do that if Abram was sort of mixed up with this idolatry thing. And that does seem to be the reason why God wanted him to leave his family behind. And it's unfortunate, but that's sometimes what we're called to do as Christians. Sometimes, in order for us to follow after Jesus, we have to leave family behind. I don't know if anybody in this room's ever had to do that, but it's a very difficult thing. I know people who have, and it's quite heartbreaking. But Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 through 31, "Assuredly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my sake and the gospel's, who shall not receive 100-fold now in this time houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and last first." Abram is sort of a case study of the very thing that Jesus is talking about. He left his family behind. He went to this place he had never seen before, but he became quite wealthy. God blessed him, and he blessed him because of his obedience and because of his faith. So Abram shows us precisely what Jesus describes. He shows us a person who left his father, he left his brothers behind, and he did so because God commanded him to, and he was blessed for doing it. So one of the great lessons of Abram's life is following God, or we might say doing what's right, sometimes requires great sacrifices. That sometimes we have to give up what is nearest and dearest to us in order to follow after the Lord. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking, which is pretty typical. So I'll stop here for a moment. Any questions, comments, thoughts that you have? Darrell, was that a nose itch or a hand? It was a nose itch. I was so hopeful. Anybody got anything they want to say? Nope. Chad says no, so we're going to keep on going here. Now, it's worth thinking about. I mean, why? This goes back to a question we talked about many, many weeks ago at this point. You know, why study the Old Testament? And hopefully up to this point you can kind of begin to see some of the reasons why it's such a valuable part of the Bible. Already in our study of the Old Testament, we've learned that there is a creator of the universe. We've learned who we are as human beings. We're created in the image of God. We've learned why things in this world aren't the way they should be. Why is evil here? Why is this world broken? We find explanations for that. We learn about the need for maintaining brotherly love and connection between people in the betrayal of Cain and Abel. We've looked at Noah, who is a forecast of the judgment that is to come. So there's all kinds of good reasons for studying the Old Testament. But one of the most important reasons why we're studying Abram, maybe a little bit more than some of the other Old Testament characters, is because Abraham plays such a prominent role in the gospel. And you all have been studying the book of Romans, so you've already gone over some of this territory when you went through Romans chapter 4. That was probably, maybe a month or two ago at this point. But Abraham's a major figure in Romans chapter 4 because Abraham gives us a prototype of walking by faith. And this is what Paul brings up in Galatians chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. "Therefore know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, 'In you all the nations shall be blessed.' So then those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham." So Abraham is a man who believed God and who obeyed God. So he serves as sort of a prototype for those who would obey the gospel, who believe in Jesus Christ and obey the gospel. So the faith of Abraham establishes a foundation. He gives us an example to follow after. And that's something that comes back several different times in the New Testament. And the last thing I want to mention here, and I don't want to get too controversial here, but I thought this was worth saying because, I've been running across this a lot on the interwebs this last couple weeks. But it's important to note that it's through Abraham's descendants that God would bless the world. That God blesses the world with Jesus through Abraham's descendants. I don't know if you all have seen this the past couple of weeks, but there's been a lot of folks around online who've been saying that Jesus was a Palestinian. Anybody seen this stuff running around online? It's probably just on Twitter, which is always a bad place to be following stuff. Darrell says he's seen it.
It's other places, but I'm not on Twitter.
Yeah. It's out there. And, the people who are really sort of pushing this thing are folks who are critical of how Israel's conducting themselves in this war right now. And look, Israel may very well be worthy of criticism. I'm not here to make any sort of political statement or to side with anyone here. That's not what this is about. But we don't have to stretch the truth to the point that we begin calling Jesus a Palestinian when he's obviously a Jew. All right, he's a Jew. Even the Quran acknowledges this. It's not like we don't need to stretch the truth in order to criticize the decisions of a nation. And that I just want to, put that out there. It's now on Facebook. This is probably going to get downgraded by the Facebook moderators, but hey, that's okay. I'm all right with that because, criticism of Israel may be fair, but we don't have to make Jesus an indigenous member of some sort of nation outside of Israel in order to establish credibility for that criticism. So that's just all I'm trying to say here. So that you can take that for what it's worth, but that's out there. Let's just remember that Jesus was a Jew. He was a descendant of Abraham, and it's through Abraham's descendants that God blesses the world. So there we go. I said it. I'll get off my soapbox now. Anybody got anything else they want to say? Nobody wants to follow up that comment, do they? All right. Yeah, what's that?
Twitter doesn't exist.
Twitter doesn't exist. It's X now. Yeah. I'm showing my age. I'm showing my age. I'll probably call it Twitter the rest of my life. It's just like meta. All right. Okay. It's Facebook. All right. Genesis chapter 12, verses 5 through 9. Then Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. And the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed going on still toward the south. So here's the rest of the journey. This is the rest of the map that I showed you a few slides previous. So he ends up here, up in Haran. This is where God calls him, and this is where he leaves his family behind, and he works his way down south here to Shechem. Shechem's right there, okay? And then he eventually moves down toward Bethel and Ai, and we'll take a look at another map here in just a moment. So that's where we're at. In fact, that map is right here. How about that? It was on the next slide. So Shechem is right up here. We're now in the hereditary land of Israel. So he starts up here at Shechem, and he moves down here to Bethel and Ai, which are right close to one another. And it's worth pointing out right now that Bethel, as a geographical location, did not exist by that name when Abraham settled there. And this is what's called an anachronism. They're referring to places by names, how they are known later on. Okay, so like when we say Manhattan Island, we all know where Manhattan Island is, right? That's where New York City is located. But it's not always been called Manhattan Island. If we were talking about that back in the 1400s, for example, we might still say Manhattan Island, but that's not how it was known back then, right? We're using an anachronism. We're calling a place by its geographical name now, but talking about it in the past. And that happens all throughout the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You have places that are called by their names, how they were known later on. So don't let that sort of thing throw you off, because sometimes people will bring that up and it can, it could throw some people off. So maybe it won't throw you off, but it's thrown other people off. So he's in Bethel, he's in Ai, and we see Abram beginning his time in Canaan. And I'm going to ask you some questions, because I knew as I was putting this slide together that I was going to be about 20 or 25 minutes in, and I will have been done doing all the talking. So here we go. We're going to ask some questions here. Throw it open. Is Abram a man of faith?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So if yes, then how do we know he's a man of faith?
It did what God said.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly. It's not difficult, right? We can tell he's a man of faith because he's obeyed God, right? It's obvious. He's done what God has told him to do. So why does he build the first altar? It's right there in the
He
text.
was told to.
Was he told to build an altar?
I thought he was. He did it to please God.
He did it to please God. Yep. I'm going to pull up Genesis 12 here because I've...
Probably wrong.
No.
He did
No.
it after he was told the
Yeah.
promise of inheriting the land.
I will give this land to your offspring. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So he didn't tell him to build the altar, but he did it because God had made this promise. I'm going to give this land to your offspring. How many offspring does Abraham have at this point? None. How old is he? 75. How old is Sarah? She's about, 10 years younger? So she's 65. Some of you are 65. Can you imagine having children at your age? Well, she's going to add another 25 years before she has her first child, which is just incredible to think about, right? So we've got a miracle at work here. God is going to do the impossible. So he builds his altar because he wants to worship God because of this promise that's been made. Now, why does he build altar number 2? Does it say? It doesn't really say, does it? Yeah. There's no real reason other than when he builds that second altar, he begins to call on the name of the Lord, right? So what I think this is beginning to show us is Abram is breaking away from the family traditions of idolatry out of which he's come. Okay? So he's gone to this new land. God has promised to give this land to his offspring. So what does he do? He builds an altar to worship God, to show his gratitude, his thankfulness. Okay? He moves on to this new location. He decides to build an altar there. And there he begins to call on the name of the Lord. And calling on the name of the Lord just simply means to worship God, to pray to God. So Abram is, how shall we say this? I think he's coming out of idolatry, so to speak, and he's making Jehovah his God. He's worshiping him as his God. I think that may be what those altars are indicating in those two examples. I don't think I'm making too much out of that, but that just seemed to speak to me as I was thinking through the passage. All right, so he's in Canaan. So who were the Canaanites, folks? What do you all think? Who were the Canaanites? Anybody know? You're like, that's why we're here. You're supposed to tell us, Wayne. Who were the Canaanites? Well, the Canaanites were basically, they were the tribes who lived in the Promised Land. And they were from all kinds of different peoples, okay? So Canaan was the fourth son and last son of Ham. Ham, who is the father of Noah. And we're given a little bit of Canaan's lineage. Back in Genesis chapter 10, Canaan begot Sidon. Sidon is, the city of Sidon was a Phoenician city, so that may be the beginnings of the Phoenician people. We can't be 100% sure about that, but there's good reason to think that. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. The sons of Heth are the Hittites, and there's a little bit of weirdness that happens with some of that history and archaeological data, so I won't go into all that and bore you too much. But so Canaan begot Sidon and Heth, the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Arkite, the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Zamorite, and the Hamathite. Lots of ites, right? Lots of ites. These are the tribes that make up the Canaanites. Okay? And you'll see them listed in various places all throughout the Old Law. And you'll see these verses that have like 6 or 7 different tribes that end with I-T-E, the ites, I like to say. Those are the Canaanites, right? The Jebusites, who are mentioned in this verse, they would be around the region, around the area where the city of Jerusalem was located. Jerusalem was a Jebusite city. Okay? So basically, the Canaanites are a generic term that incorporates all the tribes who occupied the land promised to Abraham. We use a similar term here in America. We talk about the Native Americans. Who are the Native Americans? Well, they're the hundreds of tribes that used to live here in this land. And we just use that sort of as a blanket term to cover all of those different tribes. But there are literally hundreds of them. I think there's over 500 recognized at this point right now, if I remember correctly. Does that sound right, Chad? I'm kind of hitting you up like cold here, but I think there's over 500 different recognized tribes. At least they have 500 different like reservations here in the United States. And there may be some that are doubled up. But anyways, hundreds of Native American tribes. We call them Native American. We used to call them Indian. That's no longer the preferred term, but it's the same sort of usage, right? Canaanites just referred to the tribes that inhabited the land of Canaan. That's all that term means. Okay? Does that clarify things for everybody? Does that make sense? We good? All right.
So,
Yeah, go ahead, Darrell. Oh, going back. Go ahead.
well, no, I was just thinking about even here.
Yep.
The Native Americans are the reason we call them the Native Americans because they were here when we got here. The
Yes.
Europeans.
Yeah.
So were they the Native Americans or?
Yeah. There's the great question. Yeah. And, you know,
DNA search
and which lands belong to them? Well, who knows? You know,
That's
because they traded all the time, right? They
I
were.
bring that up in this case here too, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and some of them didn't have an understanding of land belonging to them, so to speak. They were nomadic, right? They traveled around. So, yeah. But, yeah, they were the ones that lived here before we came around.
You showed a map back quite a while ago where the 3 sons of Noah.
Mm-hmm.
And so this would have been, you know, it looked like there were like 3 circles and kind of showed.
Mm-hmm.
I think you did.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
I was kind of wondering what.
Yeah, Japheth was kind of up in the north,
So,
right? And Ham was is over in Africa, and then his area kind of circled up into Israel, Syria, that area, and then Shem was kind of over in like the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah, that's kind of how they all settled out, so to speak. Yeah. Chad.
Beth looked it up just on a side note. The
Yeah.
federal government recognizes 574 tribes.
574. Thank you, Beth. Yep.
In the United States. And
Mine
then
says
they-
566.
and-
I'm pretty sure there's some that have disappeared. So.
Plus, Canada's got the First Peoples.
Right, they call them the
First
First Peoples
Yeah.
instead of Native Canadians.
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah, and you know, history is just replete with, you know, peoples being displaced. I mean, look, all of our folks, they came over from, you know, if you're, you know, white European, all of your folks came from like Russia and migrated over into Europe and began conquering all of Europe in the, you know, starting back in the BCs and going over into the early 80s. So, I mean, that's just history. History is filled with, you know, peoples being displaced and disappearing off the face of the earth. I'd like to see us maybe get to a point where that doesn't happen. That'd be nice, but it does seem to continue. So, anyways, yeah. I can't make comments like that without feeling like I'm being political, and I hate that. So, but you know, just, yeah. Anyways.
I feel your pain.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we should wish for war as Christians. I think we should wish for peace. So that's my personal feeling. All right. Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 through 16. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. All right, so Abram pretty early on runs into trials and troubles here in the land of Canaan. And, a couple slides ago we talked about how Abram had proved his faith. He had obeyed the voice of God. But obeying the voice of God does not insulate us from going through difficult times. Obeying God does not guarantee a life without trials. And what's one of the first trials that Abram faces? Well, famine. So where does he go? He's got to go to Egypt in order to find food. And there's some foreshadowing that's happening with this story. And we'll get to that here in a moment. And by foreshadowing, I mean what Abram experiences here in Egypt is parallel to what his descendants experience when they go to Egypt. So like a great author, God is using foreshadowing in order to kind of knit together a nice story for us. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Now, what's unfortunate about this story is Abram seeks to deceive Pharaoh in order to protect himself. And, we can argue whether or not what Abram said was technically a lie. Sarah was, in fact, his half-sister. They had the same father, but had different mothers. So she was technically his half-sister, which makes this sort of a half-lie or a half-truth that's said to Pharaoh. And I thought about this again today, and I just don't see any way that I can square this. This seems to me to be a lie, to be a deception. And it's just a weak moment of faith on Abram's part, isn't it? Abram's just a human like the rest of us. And he's an admirable man, but he's not perfect. And I think that that's an important lesson for us to take to heart as we're studying all of these Old Testament characters. Noah gets off the ark, plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and lies naked in his tent. I mean, it's not exactly what you'd expect from the guy who is found to be the most blameless person on the earth prior to the flood, right? And I'm not mocking Noah in any way whatsoever. I'm just simply pointing out these people were admirable. They're people to look up to. They're people to aspire to be like, but they are by no means perfect people. And it's important for us to remember that God's grace is always at work. The new covenant is built on the concept of God's grace. But even when you go back to the old covenant, you can see God's grace at work. He was dealing with imperfect people who were respectable and honorable, but who made mistakes. And I think Abram made a mistake here. But God looks after him. He plagues Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore here is your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. This is where I'd like to just spend a moment talking about the foreshadowing I see in this story. So here you got Abram and Sarah. They seek shelter in Egypt because of a famine. What took the children of Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob and all their families, what took them to Egypt? A famine. Pharaoh, in a sense, held Sarai captive, didn't he? Kind of like how Pharaoh held the children of Israel captive for a time. And Pharaoh's house was plagued, right? It was plagued because he held Sarai, and it's plagued later on because he wouldn't let the children of Israel go. When Abram left, he was enriched, right? Pharaoh gave Abram all kinds of wealth, thinking that Sarai was in fact his sister. He was trying to curry Abram's favor. And if you think back to the story of the children of Israel when they left Egypt, the Egyptians were basically just handing all of their wealth to the children of Israel in order to get them to leave. And the Bible says that, the children of Israel left very wealthy because of that. That's why they were able to build, for example, this tabernacle with all this gold, because the Egyptians had basically paid them to leave the land. That's what it amounted to. So there's some parallels happening between this story of Abram and the children of Israel later on. So there'll be moments like this along the way where we'll have some foreshadowing like this happen. It's pretty neat when you see it. At least I think it's neat. So. Any questions or comments as we draw this to a close? That's all I got for tonight. You all look like you're ready to go out and get in the
Given
snow.
current,
Yeah.
I understand at the time when this was written, Sarai's life was not super important to anybody. I have trouble
Yep.
having the
Yeah, trouble with, I'm sorry?
the fact that she's used
Yeah.
Abram.
Yeah,
twice,
yeah,
becomes
yeah.
enriched.
Yep.
What of her?
I know. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, and she's just sort of the, she's like a lot of women. She's just the victim of the culture that they live in, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and, Abram does not come across very, as a very noble character when he's saying this. I need you to lie to Pharaoh so that he doesn't kill me. Right? It just kind of comes across in a really bad way. And
He's not perfect, but I'm like, it makes him really hard to admire.
yeah, I know.
He's doing stuff like that.
Yeah, I hear you, Beth. Yeah, I hear you. And that's why, it's just good for us to bear in mind that if some of our lowest moments were there on the pages for people to read for thousands of years, we'd probably be ashamed as well, That's at least what I tell myself when I read stuff like that. And I think, man, Abram, you could have done a lot better. And then I'm like, well, Wade, you've had a couple of humdingers in your life too, that you'd wish that people wouldn't be discussing for thousands of years after you lived. So it's not a very complimentary picture of Abram, admittedly. But once again, God worked with imperfect people. I think of, what they did to Hagar, running her off. I mean, with no one to protect her. I mean, it just, yeah, it's not a complimentary picture. Yeah. And go ahead, Darrell. No.
In the 20th chapter, he does it again with Amalek.
What's that?
In the 20th chapter, he does it again with Amalek.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if I'm saying that right.
No, go ahead.
But what is interesting here, Amalek says, I took her with integrity. I thought I was doing the right thing.
Yes.
But I didn't know her.
Yes.
And God said, yeah, I kept you from touching her.
Yeah.
So there wouldn't be any sin.
Yeah.
But then Amalek on the 10th verse says, what did you have in view that you have done this thing?
Exactly right.
What were you thinking, Abraham?
Yeah, exactly. Because he does the same thing that he did to Pharaoh, right?
What were you
Yeah.
thinking? And
Yeah.
So here Abraham says, and it's still, he just says, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife.
Yeah.
It came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house, which you referred to earlier.
Yeah.
I said to her, this is your kindness that you should do for me in every place where we go, say of me, he is my brother.
Yeah.
So that was his plan as he wandered around. Don't let him know you're my wife.
Yeah.
I mean, because he did it twice. So I mean, it was it was premeditated.
Yeah,
But-
I know.
But he kind of used, like you said, it's still a lie
Yeah.
because it was designed to deceive.
Mhm.
It was based on a half truth.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind, at least something I keep in mind, is one of the reasons why we've come to a place where we as a people or as a culture are able to see that this is a bad thing is because this record has been preserved in the Scripture as well. Like, would we, would our minds be trained to see it the same way? I'm not sure. We've been educated, I think, by the Bible to see this as a real a real mistake on Abraham's part. But would we see it the same way had we not been educated by the Bible? I'm not sure. Pretty sure in other places where the Bible has not prevailed, women are continued to be treated like this in just terrible ways. So.
It appears that God protected Sarah.
Yes.
Through this.
That's a great way of looking at it. Yeah, God did. God protected Sarah from Abraham in a sense. Yeah, that's another good way of putting it. Yeah.
Which is good.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, we'll close it there, and I think we're all Christians here, so I don't know that I need to extend a gospel invitation. Boy, that's unusual. But it is good for us just to remind one another that the Lord could come at any moment, or our death could happen at any moment. So it's good just to take a few minutes from time to time to remind ourselves of that, and to remind ourselves that every choice we make, every day we've been given, we need to be sure that we are living it by walking on the straight and narrow. So if we can help anybody who's fallen off the path, if we can help you with prayers or encouragement, whatever way the church can help you, we're here. Let's stand and sing the number that Darrell has selected.